And you are live.
Thank you. Good evening. I'll call the meeting of the task force to study the municipal election laws to order, acknowledging that a quorum is present with Mr. Miller and Ms. Gaskin also joining me, as well as Ms. Leahy. We expect our other members shortly, but we've got a couple administrative things we can take care of. Everybody should have received by email the minutes for the August 9th, August 23rd meeting, as well as the September 6th hearing that occurred last week. Are there any questions or comments about the minutes? If not, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I move to approve the minutes from the dates stated.
Second.
A second.
Since, well, I guess for a formality, all in favor say aye. Aye. So the minutes pass. The next administrative task that I'd like to take care of for the task force is just reading into the record the folks that we've received written testimony from during the public comment period. So as our chair reminded everybody, there was more ways to engage than just the survey or the public hearing. And over the course of the task force, we've received public comment from a few folks. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, I just need to read their names and addresses into the record. Christopher Opilla, 23 Madison Place. Greg Brennan, 1231 Van Buren Drive. Trudy McFall, 205 Scott Drive. Ms. McFall also spoke with us. Michael Dye, 1315 Hawkins Lane. Christine Cerrone, 1321 Colony Drive. Alex Pline, 305 Monterey Avenue. And Suzanne Duffy, 17 King Court. Those were all the comments that I had record of receiving in my email. Does somebody stand out as missing? Does anybody remember anyone that's missing? All right. If not, we'll consider those acknowledged in the record. And move on. So we're at the hardest part of our work now, which is trying to get close to forming a recommendation. Just want to double check the agenda. That is all we have left to discuss. Hager's, sorry.
All.
Yeah, I know. I just want to double check. I was kind of hoping that there was one more little thing to buy time for Ian to get here. I raised Hagerstown as a possible model. Hagerstown did get back to us today. The city clerk sent over a bunch of information, unfortunately, just a few hours before this meeting about their transition. I can share a few things at a high level. They switched to the presidential election year. They did it through a short term. So they had a municipal election that elected people to a short term. It does appear that they put a question on their ballot at some point in time to ask for citizen input. But I did not get the sense from their memos in the minutes that I was able to view so far that the question was binding. It sounds like they put an advisory question on their ballot, but their citizens voted overwhelmingly in favor of moving. So we do have some of the things they shared with us was the memos that outlined changes that needed to be made to their local code and kind of the transactional pieces that needed to be taken care of to make it work. So we have about a week left under our charter. If we want to dive deep into those, if we think Hagerstown is a good model, I think we've got some good information to pull from to make recommendations to the city council. Hagerstown is also approximately the size of Annapolis. I had sent out a chart before that kind of showed the size of cities based on 2020 census data. That's my high level takeaways. Andrew?
All right, thank you. Thank you for that quick reaction after a few hours. I'm looking forward to taking a look at those documents when they get forwarded to the rest of the group. What you mentioned relates to like an additional matter that we're trying to get information on, specifically the process for getting ballot questions on the ballot here in Annapolis. So I'm curious if, again, if the documents show this, they may have not, or might not have been clear, how that question was put on the ballot in Hagerstown. Was it by the Hagerstown, I don't know if it's a city council or whatever they use it in the city, or through another mechanism. And I think we had sent an inquiry to the Annapolis City Office of Law about the possibility of, or the legal allowance of citizen-led petitioning to put a ballot question on. And if so, what the number of signatures would be required for that. Do you or Eileen or Faye, does anybody know, have we received an answer on that from the Office of Law?
She basically said that there's not it's not a clear mechanism for having a ballot question. I'm looking it up. She did send us something a while ago. I'll look for it here.
I understood her opinion to be that because state law referenced counties and not municipalities, her opinion was that it prohibited municipalities from doing it, that because they denoted counties, you could infer that they did not intend to include municipalities, which is why when I saw this in Hagerstown, it was such a big question for me of like, how did they do it?
Right.
Yeah, I remember it the same way, but I think that Andrew's question is not for the council itself to put the question on the ballot, but for citizens to put the question on the ballot. And I don't think that she had necessarily addressed that from what I can recall.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
It requires a voter petition and certification.
Okay.
However, the city code does not specify the numbers. And so I'm looking to see if she says I did, let's see. It was, I think we had to go to what the state code would be. And state code. I'm looking through it. She did send that to us. Because it was a lower threshold than what I recalled we had looked at before. I don't see it, but what she had sent, I don't see in here as far as the number of people. I know that, again, when it's been discussed in the past, there needs to be clarification in terms of what that whole process would be.
Okay, so I guess it's a two-part question in the sense. So is she saying that, yes, it is possible for citizens to get ballot questions through petitioning on the ballot, but we don't know the actual number of citizens? Or is she saying, no, citizens cannot put ballot questions on the ballot, and that obviates the question of how many citizens are needed for it?
So maybe we should go back to her, and I might tweak the question a little bit further, Andrew. Is there ballot initiative? If so, how many signatures are required on a petition? And then is there veto referendum? And if so, how many signatures are required for petition? Because there's also, one of the things I think that might be confusing matters too is Maryland, at least as I understand it, doesn't have ballot initiatives. So citizens can't put an original idea on the ballot. They can only potentially veto an act of the legislative body. But again, that's my understanding from a while back teaching on it. It may not be current, and I think we should check it, but
And my concern with the ballot question is it pushes this off. It kicks the can down the road yet again. It would mean that it would go, even if we could pull it off, it would go on the ballot in 2025, which means.
well, can I ask a question?
Mhm.
Is the impetus of the interest in a ballot question about any change to election law that we would recommend, like also adopting state law, or is it really only about the partisan, nonpartisan issue?
The ballot question came up with the Charter Revision Commission because they were trying to look at a way to move it forward. Because for the past 3 charter revisions, which means over the span of 30 years, each Charter Revision Commission has recommended going to nonpartisan elections. And the city council has never, I guess they took it up once. They took it up a couple of years ago and it didn't go anywhere. So the thought was maybe if we just go to a ballot question, we can move it forward. It would give it a little bit more oomph. On the other hand, part of the reason for this task force was to say, let's look at elections. Let's look at the broader picture and see if we can't make a recommendation to either move in that direction or stay where we are, along with other initiatives. Because the only thing they brought up for the ballot question was, well, it was the sinking and also the nonpartisan versus partisan.
I'd love to hear from the others too on kind of, did they think the ballot question was important for all of the issues, or because I always kind of viewed it as more of an issue for the nonpartisan partisan decision. Andrew, you had your hand up.
I mean, so I think the ability of citizens to put a ballot question on the ballot goes like well beyond the recommended reforms that we're recommending. I mean, this could be used for a broad basis of like changes and reforms, ones that we're not even thinking about or conceptualizing. It's just another way in which citizens can try to get changes implemented in the city government. So I'm not, I guess my interest in understanding it is, one, I think without a doubt, regardless if we're thinking about it being useful for implementing the reforms that we're recommending, I think it's something we definitely want to have a clear understanding of, because we may want to make recommendations about how to use recommendations about how to codify in city code the use of ballot questions, specifically citizen-led petition ballot questions. So I'm thinking about it beyond just what we're doing here.
That's fair. Faye, do you want to add anything on it?
No, I don't have anything to add in addition to what Andrew just said.
Or John Michael?
Came in a little late, so if you could just catch me up on what the question actually is.
Yep, it was whether, so there was some interest in a question that it sounds like we don't have a clear answer from the Office of Law and about ballot questions, and I had asked whether the interest in ballot questions was about the partisan, nonpartisan choice, and finding a way to deliberate that, or whether it was broader. And I appreciate I was looking at it as from a tactical sense, in that others were thinking about broader policy with it and the ability to get things on the ballot.
Well, I mean, for us, so what would the recommendation then be? That I don't know.
If I can jump in, I don't even think we're at the point for a recommendation. We're just like trying to figure out like what the law is in terms of ballot questions, like in the state of Maryland, and the ability of municipalities to have citizen initiated ballot questions be put on the ballot, and then we can kind of figure out if we can recommend changes and reforms around that.
I mean,
So-
it's not, is it not in the charter? Our ballot questions not in the charter, or are they just petitions, or?
So it's a little convoluted. And you have to refer back to state law. And then there's question about whether it's just veto referendum or ballot initiative. Recognizing we only have a week left under our charter and not knowing the commitments of the Office of Law. Is there appetite to consider a recommendation that says something like, the task force believes citizens should have the right to petition an issue to the ballot, whether as a veto referendum or a ballot initiative, and the city code should create a clear path for doing so? I mean, is there that much of a belief in this that?
Well, I would say that if, you know, if part of our recommendation was to, you know, mirror a lot of the state law, that we should just go with what the state says. Because I, you know, would want the state and the county, Anne Arundel County, to be the ones administering this. That being said, like, you know, yeah, citizens should be able to initiate a ballot question, or at least initiate some kind of referendum. But I don't know whether it would be appropriate to do it separately from our other recommendations. I'd have to think more on it.
I mean, the ballot question has been put forth already. We don't necessarily, I mean, I'm just thinking of this group has the ability to provide additional information to the city council so that the city council can start moving forward if they choose on these recommendations. If they move forward on it, there's going to be opportunity for public input. So I'm just kind of, I know I'm kind of chomping at the bit a little bit, because I recognize that we need these changes sooner rather than later. Depending, you know, and if we're wanting public input, if the reason for mimicking or saying, you know, what the Charter Revision Commission suggested is to hear from the public, there are other mechanisms for hearing from the public beforehand. Like I said, the ballot question came up. Ballot question has come up a number of times. It came up early in the last election, and no one picks it up. And that's my concern. The latest thing is we're going to do a ballot question. Well, who's going to do it? Who is going to make the petition? Who's going to get the signatures? Who's going to put it forth? And there might be appetite for it, but I think there's also the recent questionnaire shows that there's appetite for this. And so the task force has the ability to make the recommendation. Certainly if the group wants to do it through a ballot question, fine, but I don't want the task force feeling that that's the only mechanism for which they can do it and the only mechanism for which you can get public input.
Appreciate the point, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I'd reiterate that I feel strongly that at a minimum, we should receive guidance from the Office of Law about what the law is as it relates to citizen initiated ballot questions. Because my understanding is we're not asking them like a week before our charter ends. I think this has been this is something that's been brought up in this task force for over a month, if I remember correctly. So I think this is important. And I'll just emphasize, I think it's important beyond the work that we're doing here with respect to the reforms that we're talking about here. It's important as a mechanism that we should consider for citizens to be able to affect governance in the city, whether it has to do with elections or other policy areas.
Right. But we do know it is in city code that, to me, the only thing that's really missing is how many signatures you need. We know that the public can put forth the ballot question. She's answered that. It's just a question of how many, and that would refer to state law. It's not in the city code.
All right.
Because the initial question we asked her was, could the city council itself initiate a ballot question? And we asked for an opinion on that, and she came back and said, no, that's not something that the city council can do.
Ian, to catch you up, we've approved the minutes. We discussed the Hagerstown documents briefly, and then this discussion has been about ballot questions.
Gotcha.
And
Thank you.
whether or
Sorry
not
for
we get a
being
clear
late.
answer from the Department of Law.
Yeah, crazy day. But so, yeah, I mean, my recollection was the same, right? Like we started thinking about the way the county has the ability to basically have the legislative body refer something to the agenda. She went and looked at it and said only counties have that ability. It's very specific. And then I guess the question is really, but everyone knows there is a path by collecting signatures. They don't seem to, I mean, we asked, Eileen and I both asked that question, like, what is the number, right? Like, because we've, you know, as we've talked about this, there's a different statute you know, basically the high water mark of the governor's race, right? It's sort of sets the number in the state code, right? But I was sort of less than enthused in sort of the response, because it was sort of like my fear would be like, you know, you would have that, you know, it's a reading of the state code. It's not in the city code. So like, what do? We say we should incentivize that to make it easier. And then like the Office of Law at that point, when someone is actually in the midst of trying to do something, to put something on the ballot, is like, it's a different number. Yeah, like I guess I'm, but I mean, that was sort of my recollection too, just to reinforce what Eileen said of the response we got.
So Ian, just for my understanding, like, are they just saying like that they're not comfortable giving a number, like they don't know, or like it's like they can't transpose state law to the city, so there needs to be legislation? Do you have a sense of like what they see as the next steps, like given that, or?
Yeah, I mean, the sense, at least from Ashley, was that you know, there is a number that they would then insist on if someone brought a petition in the city, but she was not committal about what that was. Is that fair, Eileen? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at her, you know, her response, which is, you know, the certification is possible, but the process. So, you know, I'm almost thinking based on that, we almost need to create city code in order to facilitate a ballot question. So that would be a two-part process, you know, making a recommendation to amend the election code for ballot questions, and then utilize that for asking about some of the recommendations. Again, you know, you're putting everything in the context of the ballot questions, and one of the questions we've been kind of tossing around is syncing with the state. And if we're syncing with the state, then we're going to go with state law. So we'll end up somewhat in the same place. I guess the question is, does this need to go to a ballot question? Do our recommendations need to go to a ballot question, or can this task force move the recommendations directly to the city council and the board of elections?
got
And then,
So I think I agree with Andrew that we need to resolve this not because of our recommendations. So just all cards on the table. I favor moving to adopting state law, and I favor going on the presidential ballot cycle because it's the shorter of the two statewide cycles. So like, I think there's a lot of value to that, but the gubernatorial ballot is incredibly long. Regardless of that, and I think the city council could do that on its own quickly, and I'm comfortable recommending that without it going to a ballot question. I still think there needs to be a clear path for ballot questions. I definitely was making the mistake of thinking about this just tactically in terms of our recommendations. But when Andrew raised the point, it's a good one, that there's a bigger policy thing. So that's at least where I'm at, is, you know, I would be very comfortable moving on a recommendation that we adopt state law, not through a ballot question, but just saying, like, I would recommend we adopt state law and that we move to a statewide election cycle. I think it's preferably the presidential election, just because that ballot is shorter. but I would still want a ballot question recommendation because of the broader policy issues.
Yeah, Andrew, please. Jump in.
If I could, I'm sure folks are like sick about talking about ballot questions more, but so I'll try to parlay this into, I guess, a broader concern that this discussion raises for me. So like, I am inclined, for all the reasons that I think Scott's mentioned, others have mentioned, to move to state code and adopt state code, right? But if we're having such trouble interpreting the state code with respect to ballot questions at the city level, like how many other areas of state code are we going to struggle to transpose onto the city level? So I'm not saying that's a reason not to adopt state code, but I think that's another kind of broader issue, broader question that we might, if we haven't already, maybe there's been conversations I'm not aware of, but that we might want to sync with like the Office of Law to get a sense of how we actually just take that state code and apply it to the municipal level, because presumably the state code, unless I'm mistaken, doesn't talk a lot about mayors and alderpersons and municipal level positions and funding limits at the state level might be different than funding limits at what we would want at the city level, that sort of thing. So anyway, it's just a broader issue, broader concern that like this conversation raises for me.
I mean, to that point, I think in the context of a recommendation, right? I mean, it could be that, the recommendation is the council should rewrite the elections titles and basically take, the state code where they can, but right, there's going to be after a legislative drafting piece to basically figure that out. And then maybe we flag a couple items like the ballot initiative process needs to be really looked at and cleaned up from the state code. Yeah, where there's so like in some ways maybe like our recommendations are that, because like, we're not going to do it for them. It's sort of the side by side of the code and figure that out. We're going to say you should, almost everywhere you can, you should accept the state code, right? And then, and here's a couple reasons why, the arguments why it makes some sense, I would think, and this is a pretty good illustration of it. I'd be comfortable with that. I think.
Well, I think one of the other overriding questions that also needs to be addressed though before going there is what type of elections. If the recommendation of this group is to look at nonpartisan, then it's a different path because the state law does not do nonpartisan. So, I mean, there's some other questions, and that's kind of when I did that comparison the other day of trying to decide which road we're going to go down. So, yes, you can adapt state code to the municipal, and I think Jared spoke to that a bit in terms that there can be things as far as the donation levels and things like that. And I imagine Hagerstown did that. But I think we need to start saying, or the group needs to say, are we going to go down the road of nonpartisan or are we going to go down the road of partisan? If you're going down the road of partisan, then are you going to be syncing with state code or not? And if you're going to sync with state code, and then there's also as far as the elections. If you're going to go down the nonpartisan, then that's a whole different, then you're pretty much already out of state code in many respects. Not completely, but.
I wholeheartedly disagree with that. If you look at Hagerstown's local code, they very clearly adopted state law. There's several state law chapters that deal with blanket primaries. Boards of education are elected through blanket primary. Judges are elected through a blanket primary in a way. So I do think it makes sense to probably tackle the question of, do we think it's worth adopting state code and having the county board of elections administer the election by syncing it up with one of the statewide elections and then handling the nonpartisan questions separately? Because I do think if we talk about adopting state code in conjunction with having the county board administer it as part of the either the gubernatorial or the presidential election. The problems you solve in Eileen, your chart really kind of made this crystal clear, right? Like you solve early voting, you solve automatic absentee ballot registration, you solve like all the little inconsistencies that could really kind of hang somebody up and maybe prevent them from participating in elections. They end up getting solved because the state code has adopted it. Same day voter registration. I think, the city's probably never going to have the technology to accommodate that, but the state, it's different. So I, if only for the purpose of framing a conversation so we can actually move on a recommendation, I would like to make a motion. And I would like to move that we recommend adopting state law. And I'll be specific rather than general, adopting state law and transitioning the election to the presidential ballot cycle so that the state board and county boards of election can actually manage the election process for the city, much like is done in Hagerstown.
Okay, is there a second?
I would, does this have to do with switching to nonpartisan, or is this something separate?
No, that would be a completely separate question. So
Okay.
it would.
I mean,
be-
in that case, it's in the correct direction, so I second.
And then we can have some discussion. I'm curious what everyone thinks. I mean, it does strike me the sequencing, right? If you decide to make that recommendation, then things like nonpartisan is like, if they were to actually flow in the normal order of things, like the council would have less control over that because they would need to be, the state legislature probably and the county would need to agree, right? So it's a prioritizing thing, right? If we think that's the most important move is to try to move on to the cycle and move with the county, right? Like, yeah, I think you can still make the other recommendations that flow from that, but you're just saying you're not in the driver's seat for those necessarily. Right? But so on Scott's motion, is there other thoughts or?
I was just going to mention, if I'm thinking about this, there's two ways of doing it. I mean, the city council could just make a blanket adopting state code with specific caveats or specific pieces for the municipal, or it could just say, we're going to amend municipal code and transpose the state code into it. Does that make sense? I see it as kind of two different mechanisms.
So when I made my motion, I was having it adopt by reference the way Hagerstown does. And the reason why is because then it doesn't require subsequent action if state law changes.
Mhm.
It automatically kind of follows state law.
Yes,
So
exactly.
if you look at the Hagerstown example, what they did, and it's a really elegant solution in that it's like incredibly simple. So they have like a section where they very quickly adopt state law. And then they have a section where they say where state law says this in the city of Hagerstown, it means this. So there's certain things where it's like, instead of the Secretary of State, it means the city clerk. Those types of things. So that way there are terms that just make sense. But that's why I like adopt by reference, is because here's one of the things that I think drives me to thinking this is a good thing to do. What I heard very clearly from Ashley and from David Garris and from others is that the city's kind of struggled to keep pace with some election stuff. And Regina does an excellent job as our city clerk. She has a very full plate. She's not a full-time elections official. She doesn't have a full-time election staff. She gets to hire, I think, a part-time person like every 4 years to help with the election stuff. Whereas the state board and the county boards, they have professional staff that are constantly recommending regulations and legislative updates. And I apologize. I jumped in there and I think Faye was getting ready to speak a moment ago. And so I'm sorry, Faye.
No, you're perfectly fine. I agree with what you're saying about adopting the state law by reference. The only point of the version is that I would not want to go with the presidential cycle, but rather go with the gubernatorial cycle. And although we had a very, I guess, not necessarily statistically significant response rate with the survey, if I remember correctly, most of those who did respond said they would not mind changing the cycle, but they would prefer to go with the gubernatorial cycle. And I agree with that as well. To me, it more closely aligns with what we're doing within the state of Maryland. I mean, when you get into the presidential election and all the other things that come with it, I think that can muddy what's going on, and it's kind of like removed. And so I agree with what you're saying. The only difference is I do not agree with aligning with the presidential cycle.
For the
Andrew?
sake of building consensus, can I offer an amendment to my motion? So instead of stating specifically the presidential election, stating that it would be synced with a statewide election and leaving it open for the city council to work out.
Andrew?
I think so. Since Scott introduced an amendment, I think before I can speak, there's got to be a call for seconds to the amendment.
Oh, yeah, I second it then.
You did.
And then my understanding is there needs to be the vote on the amendment before. Since it's a subsidiary motion, there would be a vote on the amendment before I.
Well, I think we were having sort of discussion on the amendment itself, and then sort of reworked his amendment, which now has been seconded. So yeah, I mean, we're sort of a little bit out of sequence here, but I think Greg, right? I mean, in response to Faye's thought, which I think makes sense, right? Like, we tell them they should move to the recommendation is they should move to one of the cycles. That but
So
go ahead, Scott.
sorry, just on a point of order, I think process wise, I offered a motion which was seconded and we were discussing, and then in response to Faye's comment, I offered an amendment to the motion, which was seconded. I do think we have to vote on the amendment to actually change the motion. It doesn't adopt the motion. It just officially changes the motion.
okay. So the Scott's amendment, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay.
So the amendment passes, I see. The only reason I'm opposed is that, not because of like the substance of it, is just that I think that when we're talking about recommendations, we should vote on each recommendation separately. So adopting state code should be a vote. Adopting timing of the presidential election cycle should be its own vote. So somebody like, let's say, I think Faye sounded like she has split support. She supports adopting state code, but doesn't adopt that. So that puts like individuals who want one thing but not another in like a difficult position. So I would just say we split them up. So that was my first comment. And then just before we start voting on motions, could we just get like a sense of the process here of how we're going to kind of be doing this from here on out? So is this our last opportunity to introduce motions, or are we going to have another meeting where we can introduce motions for recommendations? I think that would be helpful for, at least for me, before I understand, like before I choose how to proceed.
Yeah. I'm totally flexible about that. I mean, obviously we can easily have another meeting if we want to sort of get to a place where we've, whatever we can agree to tonight, and then sort of be able to look at that and then sort of figure out sort of what's missing or what needs to be changed. I think that makes a lot of sense. So
Okay. All right. So in that case, then I'm gonna move to amend Scott's motion to not include the portion as it relates to election timing. And so the motion to focus specifically on the adoption of state code. So that would be the amendment I'd like to introduce.
I'll second it.
great. Any discussion before we? Okay. All in favor? Great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree. So like very single issue sort of votes are probably the way to do this, right? Single topic. Okay.
So for clarity, just because I've been tracking the motion through the changes, the motion that is left is adopting state law by reference, recommending adopting state law by reference.
Yes. Any other discussion? Okay. All in favor? Great. Okay. Who has another motion they'd like to consider? Would you like to get into something along the lines of, should we be, sure, Andrew?
I mean, I think this has been discussed a lot, so I think it's maybe something we can move forward on, but like, I'd like to move that Annapolis adopts a blanket nonpartisan primary. So that's the core of the motion right there.
Is there a second?
Second.
Oh, we're talking about making the recommendation, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we don't have to come up with any of the ideas like how many people in the primary are going to the general. We just say this is our recommendation.
Well, I do think we want to get to that. I felt like we were just
Issue by issue.
Yeah, I just felt like we'd feel out like the core of it, which is just moving to a blanket non-primary, and then we at some point talk about like how many people can be voted, like how many people an individual voter can vote for, how many people move on to the general, that sort of thing. But at the core, it's about, the motion is to recommend that Annapolis adopt a blanket nonpartisan primary.
Okay.
Great. Any other discussion?
I have a question just for clarification. And I know we discussed this a million times, but I just still need to be clear, Andrew. Because when we talked the last time, this when you introduced the blanket primary. So with the blanket primary, although we're saying nonpartisan, on the ballot itself, is there an opportunity to still indicate the party affiliation on the ballot?
That's an excellent question. So yes, what it would say on the ballot is, and this is one of the details that we are going to want to codify in the recommendation, but what it can say on the ballot, it won't say, let's say candidate John Doe is underneath the name. It won't just say Republican Party, right? It won't say John Doe Republican Party. What it would say is that John Doe party preference Republican Party. So constitutionally, the ballot can't say that this John Doe is representing the Republican Party because it's not like specifically a Republican Party primary. So it would just have to say the party preference and then reference that party. And I think voters generally make the connection that this individual, of course, prefers the Republican Party. So, therefore they would hold those types of views. And of course, vice versa for Jane Doe, who might be have a preference for the Democratic Party, it would say under her name, it would say party preference, Democratic Party.
Okay, so as part of your motion, I know this is an amendment or
This is not an amendment. So I was just trying to get like the core understanding that like we would recommend a blanket nonpartisan primary. And then I think there's like 4 or 5 dimensions of that we're going to have to work out, that being one of them. And then some of the things that Jan mentioned as well. So right now I just move to that type of primary system.
Okay, so I just didn't want that to be lost when we actually make the recommendation and put pen to paper.
I support that. Like I would support 100% having that party preference language on the ballot as well. So I think we should do that. Yeah.
I guess I'm just wondering, do you think calling it a blanket nonpartisan is might be confusing to the public because we're also saying they'll be able to put their party preference?
No,
We're
I
not
don't.
saying that yet.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, is a blanket primary considered a nonpartisan? It will be, okay,
Because it's not a party nominating primary.
correct, okay.
So should the terminology be blanket, as getting back to what Alina saying, blanket primary as opposed to saying blanket nonpartisan primary?
That's
If
what
we
I'm
say
asking.
blanket primary, is that still accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could say either one. I think when we get down to like the nitty-gritty of like writing this out and making sure like everything aligns, we can choose like what's the clearest language. But if it's everyone's more comfortable, I can amend that to just say blanket primary, full stop, and then in the description of it, we talk about the process itself. And
I feel comfortable with that amendment. Do you want me to make the amendment? Are you amending your motion?
all right, sure. So
Make
then
the
I'll
motion.
introduce an amendment. I'd like to move to amend the motion that the task force recommend that Annapolis City move to a blanket primary process.
There's a second.
I second it.
Any other discussion, or we got to move to a vote? All in favor? Opposed? Okay. So that is to approve the amendment or the change, right? And the
Yeah.
underlying. Then we have to do, so any other discussion on the underlying now amended? All in favor? Great, thank you, everybody. Let's see.
Andrew, it sounded like there were more dimensions of a blanket primary that you wanted to explore. I know there's another question that I'd like to raise, but I didn't want to jump in if you were on same topic.
I mean, this is something that I think, and I would personally recommend that we have a work session to develop the language and whatnot, because there's so much to go over and there's so much to look at. So I'll just say three dimensions of it. So one is what Faye mentioned is like, okay, what is the language underneath the candidates? So just say party preference, party affiliation, or whatever. So what are those options? So that would be one. Two is how many individuals can a voter in the primary vote for? So you can have it so that a voter doesn't just pick one candidate, but they can pick two candidates or three candidates, right? They're three most preferred candidates. And if we have it such that voters can only choose one versus that they can choose two, that has actually pretty important implications for like the nature of how races play out. So again, that would be something we want to talk about. And then finally, we would want to talk about how many of the top vote getters move on. So do we want just the top 2 vote getters to move on to the general? Do we want the top 4 vote getters to move on to the general? Those sorts of things would be some of the aspects I think we'd want to flesh out.
I'd be excited if there were 4 candidates for any one office.
I guess so. This is the first one we're sort of looking at that way. I mean, I guess like, and I mean, I think a work session may be actually more useful than just sort of as we get further into this. But I think there's an interesting question there. Like, are those 3 things that we have to take a position on, or is it in sort of a written document that's an advocacy document of the council? Is it we think you should go to nonpartisan blanket primary, and then here are all the things you should consider that you're going to have to make a decision on? Do we? I mean, and like, or do we want to be specified? Sort of each of those things is sort of the recommendation. I guess like to Faye's point, like if you're worried about getting rid of a partisan primary, then we definitely recommend you should have that sort of language that denotes a partisan. So like I'm kind of agnostic on it as we think about how to take the things we can agree on that will then get translated into a written report, right, and delivered and communicated. So I'm curious sort of what your thoughts are. This is sort of the first one we're really getting into that of sort of a high level recommendation, and then sub recommendation that could be made or just are sort of questions that they will have to wrestle with. Scott?
I like the idea of raising the party preference listing as a potential kind of salve or solution for folks who are worried about a switch from partisan to nonpartisan. I'm a little concerned that there might be technical issues that we're not even considering. Like I don't know of any blanket primaries in Maryland that are running in that way right now. Maybe they exist. I just don't know of any. I did want to raise the, how many do you pick and how many move forward? I kind of feel like that might be an easy issue to dispense with if we just let history be our guide. Like, if a primary to be contested needs more than 2 candidates.
Your volume kicked off.
Yeah, I meant to lower my hand and I muted myself.
I'm sorry, Scott,
Just-
what was your question? Because
Oh, I was saying, I think we could probably pretty easily dispense with the like, how many should people vote for in the primary and how many should move forward to a general in a blanket primary, just looking at the last 4 election cycles and the ones before that. I mean, we'd be very fortunate if we had more than 2 candidates for most of these city council races. And so if we kind of set up a primary system where it was top 2 advanced, I think absent a big change, and I'm optimistic that if we kind of even the playing field for unaffiliated and third parties, that maybe we draw in some more candidates. We'll still have primaries that are basically uncontested.
right, well, you would have had that in the last election. I'm trying to think.
We would have had in every wards
Oh, you
except
would.
for 8.
No, I guess you didn't have 2 Dems and a Republican in one race.
Yeah, 8 would have been the only one that would have had a truly kind of contested primary if we had
That's the one I'm
top 2
thinking of.
advance, yeah.
Right, so in that, if you went in this model, you had 2 Dems and a Republican, so are you saying the top 2 would go? And also, what would be the percentage that they had to attain? If all 3 of them got 33%, do they all go? So the other thing I remember Jared mentioning was something called a sore loser clause. And I'm not quite sure what that was, but I remember him talking about that. And also the issue of write-in candidates. I think the sore loser clause is that, so that if someone, the way it currently works, if someone loses in the primary, they can't register as, say, an independent in the general.
Yeah.
They can be a write-in, but they can't. So I think that's what he meant by the sore loser clause.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Andrew?
Yeah, I just want to briefly just back what Scott said, like there might be technical challenges here. So a lot of the examples of these blanket primaries come from, at least I've been looking at, are out of state as well as, and so we want to make sure, I guess we'll have to get review from the Office of Law and all that sort of thing to make sure that we can get these implemented in Maryland if in fact, the city council or a citizen-led petition can make them happen. But I do hope that from the package of recommendations, if implemented, we are going to get more competitive elections, right? So we talked about ballot access. I think, Scott, you had good recommendations of that. We've talked about maybe campaign financing, so stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of things that could hopefully boost the candidate numbers and get us in a better position in that regard.
Good point. Scott?
So Andrew jogged my memory on this. Even if we adopt state law by reference, we likely have to recommend a path for getting on the ballot because state law does not include the office of alderman or mayor. So the standards and qualifications for getting on the ballot. I've been pretty consistent that, I think it should be equal for everybody. I think a blanket primary supports that it should be equal for everybody. And so we really kind of have to figure out, is it a check or a petition to get on? And just looking at all the other municipalities in the top 10, it feels like it's most commonly just a check, or actually there were a couple where I couldn't even find what the fee was. So it may just be fill out this form.
Yeah.
So I would make a recommendation that the path to getting on the blanket primary ballot simply be paying the filing fee.
I'll second it.
Any discussion?
I just think that when we get to our working session and we put the details in it, that we come up with what that fee would be. But I think that everybody should be able to get on it.
Scott, I'm sorry, Andrew.
So, right now, Scott, you have experience with the most experience with this, obviously, given your past running for office. So the reason that we don't have a lot of individuals on the primary ballot in part is that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are only going to nominate one individual, right? So if it is just anybody who pays. So I guess I worry a little bit about this because, all right, so let's say we set the fee pretty low. I think we'll say $100. That means we get a flood of people, and anybody who wants to get on there can get on there. And then you might have a large swath of people on the ballot in the primary, at least. Am I missing something?
I don't think you're missing something, but I don't think I agree with you because, I mean, if you are registered as a Republican or a Democrat, you can just get on the ballot right now and just for writing a check. And I don't even know if it's $100. I feel like it might have been less than that.
I think
I
it's
think it's less
60.
than that.
That's, yeah, 60 was coming to mind. And the primaries are also so uncompetitive. Is that I mean, I feel like if you just want your name on the ballot, I mean, really, there were 4 Republican candidates for city council last time around. So there were 4 seats where somebody could have just for a $60 check, if they were Republican, gotten on the ballot. There were at least 2 uncontested seats that I can recall completely where, a second Democrat could have gotten on the ballot for just, so I don't feel like people are jumping to get on when it's easy because the whole premise of I only had to write a check because I was in a primary is that the primary would prove that I was like viable as a candidate because the theory is that the primary would be competitive. But the history of Annapolis is if you write a check, you're on the general election ballot more often than not.
So let me ask this with like
Yeah.
Hagerstown and these other places that are blanket to my understanding. What is the threshold for getting on the ballot in those cases?
Sorry, I'm trying to pull up.
I mean, there are other pieces. I mean, such as you have to live in your you have to have lived in Annapolis, you have to have lived in your ward.
For a certain amount of time.
So there are other,
How
Others.
about this? So, what I would say is, I think I agree with the notion that this needs to be equalized across parties, and unaffiliated individuals need to have equal access to the ballot. I do think we want to get more information and think through the implications of what exactly it takes to get on the ballot, and perhaps that might fit for a work session. So I would introduce a motion to amend this motion to say that we will that the task force will recommend the city equalize ballot access across parties and for party members and unaffiliated individuals. And then the thinking is there, once we go into that work session, we'll have done some more background, and then we can hammer down just exactly what that access would look like. So that would be an amendment that I'd like to introduce as a subsidiary to your motion.
right?
Is there a second?
I second it.
Thank you.
I just
I
want to
mean-
make, I also just, I'm thinking, I don't want the task force to feel like they've got to get sometimes into the super specifics either, because again, it would be interesting to be able to see side by side state code and see what they're saying too. So, because there's opportunity. I like the idea of just saying equalized candidacy for all candidates, and we may not have the time to really get into setting fees and some of the other types of things.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, adopting a blanket primary forces you to equalize the standard because there's not 2 separate primaries and then a petition onto the ballot process. It's just getting into the primary.
Because the recommendation could be, please do this, and then the Board of Elections is then tasked with figuring out how you do it.
So a thought, the Board of Education runs on a blanket primary. And John Michael, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if you file to run for Board of Education, you just pay a filing fee. There's no petition requirement for Board of Education, is there?
No, just a filing fee, and I think you need to have a treasurer and you need to be in good standing.
So you could look at the Board of Education races and get a sense of whether there's flooding of the ballot that occurs.
Do you know what the
Uh,
filing fee
Board of
is?
Education might be a bad example. It's rather contested these days. But even here, up in where I've been working, it's manageable, even with more contestants than usual.
So, I mean, I would say that's a good example, right? So you have a situation where you have a heated political environment, which maybe if it's not the case right now, could come to a particular ward. And then with $6,000 from a wealthy donor could hand out $60 to whatever 100 people and get them all on the ballot. And that could cause a lot of problems for the primary. It's like that easy to really like muck up the system. But I think, Scott, your point was good that I guess, do we really even need to identify this if we have now agreed that we'll likely move forward with that blanket primary system? I guess in effect that already equalizes it, or what's your thought process here in terms of introducing this motion?
I mean, we could, so my thought is, now that we've forced an equalization, there's a choice of, all right, so what's the path to getting on? Is it write a check or send a petition? We could, and this gets back to kind of Ian's thoughts on the last motion, just say, by adopting a blanket primary, you will have to adopt a standard that is equal for all candidates, regardless of party affiliation or preference, to get on the ballot. And your choices are a filing fee, a petition, or a combination of the two. Maybe we just avoid getting into that particular specific. I was just leaning in and saying, let's just make it a filing fee. In part because of the look that I had at the municipals, and I believe I sent everybody the chart.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sort of where Scott is. I'm skeptical that even if you were to sort of make this happen as a blanket primary overnight, that we would see 1 million new people in the city who all of a sudden want to be, sort of serious candidates, right? Like there's going to be some people who might do it as a lark for $60, right? Like but like, right? Like just like in a primary, we've had in my experience here, there's been sometimes people run in a primary and don't actually run a real campaign, but then just to sort of have the experience of putting their name on a ballot, and that's designed to basically weed that out. And theoretically, I mean, this would too. So like, I'm not sure, like, obviously I'm happy to accept the amendment and go for it, because I think but I think the real question we're going to get to is like, how granular do we want to get on any particular sort of top line amendment, proposal, and sort of spelling out things, and how much of it is, are we just like, these are things you're going to have to consider if you take this recommendation.
Okay, so if just to back up, so Scott's proposed motion was to have a filing fee, use it as a filing fee. So yeah, I would be against that. Like, I would want to see, moving to a blanket primary, I would want to see like some level of citizen support, whether it's like 100 signatures or something, to protect against maybe it won't happen often, but I can easily see like a very heated primary in a particular environment, and there would be ways to create problems with that. So that in my view, so I guess, yeah, I would like introduce that amendment, or reiterate that amendment, that we should we should equalize access to the ballot across all parties and unaffiliated individuals. That's the amendment. So-
Okay, is there a second?
It was seconded by Fay.
That's right. Okay. So we're basically just taking out any specifics about how to do it and just sort of the concept of that it should be equalized.
Yeah, so sorry to, but yeah, I think definitely, like, if we do a work session, we can talk through and like
Yeah.
come up with like more specifics. But I think it'll be useful to identify how other cities do it, what's the result been, that sort of thing, before we do that.
So we're just
Yes, true.
agreeing that there should be some sort of electoral CAPTCHA system, to stop bad actors.
I think that's something we could work out in a work session and whatnot. I'm just saying that we should.
I'm not talking about the specifics, just that there should be some kind of system.
Yes.
That's what the
Yes.
amendment is.
Yeah, I mean,
That's the motivation behind the amendment, yes.
Okay.
at this point, I don't know what the value is in adopting the motion if it's amended, because it basically says do something that adopting a blanket primary would do. So maybe for the sake of ease, so that way we don't have to vote on an amendment and vote on a motion, since we know we want to discuss this in a work session, I'll move that we table further discussion of the underlying motion.
I'll second that.
Thank you for that. All in favor?
Aye.
Tabling? Great. Yeah, it's funny. I had a flash of the story about like one of these, like JFK's first campaign, where they went and found the big opponent. They found someone in the congressional district with the same last name and get paid to put them on the ballot to split the vote. So yeah, we have some folks here in town that would like that kind of shenanigans probably. So we probably need to think through some of that. Great. Okay, make a note.
But I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, but it could also be some people that may be new to the political process and have been seeing what's going on and decide, I need to throw my thing in there. And so they take that primary period to really get their name out there and get their positions out there. And so it may be a very valuable candidate, and not somebody that's necessarily a bad apple that's trying to come, and just shake it up. But yeah, really shake it up because of what's been going on. So I can see like both perspectives in order to get on there, because you do have people that are unknown that would be really excellent candidates. They may be neophytes to the political process, but doesn't mean that they would not be, a valuable candidate and somebody's really going to go out there and work and make things happen for the good of all people.
I totally agree. And that's the goal, right? Like, it's to sort
Yeah.
of be able to bring. So right. So yeah, and we can get it as the work session, right? But like, is it 100 signatures or is it $60? What's more conducive to those people who have not been a part of the process wanting to get part of the process, which is what we want to encourage, right? Eileen.
There's also other things that go along. It's not just the filing fee, but also the process of doing campaign finance reports.
Yep.
And following other rules that go along with the elections. So they have to comply with other election law to make it to the ballot also. So I just wanted to bring up that point. If you're not filing your fees or you're not following other election law, it may not make it to the ballot either. So it's not just a filing fee
Sure.
and maybe some signatures. There's also other things that mold that path.
Okay.
But in a related item, which has come up a little bit before, that you might want to consider is that currently in code, and I don't know if it's in state code, once you're elected, you don't necessarily need to live in your ward. There's nothing in code saying that you have to reside in the ward that you represent. So I don't know if that doesn't quite fall under candidates, but I think it's something related that we might want to consider.
I
I don't-
agree.
yeah.
I think you should have lived in your ward for a certain time period, and that you should remain in your ward on the time that you're in that office.
Right. Well, you
So-
have to be in a certain amount of time in order to run.
Not that long,
Once you-
but yeah.
Once you're elected, there's nothing in code stating that alder persons need to be residing in their respective ward.
I don't know. We could copy and paste what they use for Maryland delegates. They changed that, so now you have to live in the legislative district that you represent.
Mhm. I don't mean to get off course. It's just something that I know that this has come up in the task force also before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it should, you know, if there's not, I mean, there is no language. I know when I was on the council, we had an alderman who was, you know, the capital was out knocking on doors trying to figure out where he lived in his ward and where he was staying, which was not in his ward. But like, you know, what's the enforcement mechanism of that, right? Like, and how is it become illegal? Then, yeah,
There's some pretty famous lawsuits on point. Members of the General Assembly.
Right. But it could be another recommendation.
Yep.
Is it worth, so we started to talk about syncing with a statewide election and then we moved away from it. Is it worth just polling ourselves to see if there's a preference for the gubernatorial or the presidential election and then adopting a recommendation on that? I got Andrew's point of splitting the issue, but I didn't know if there was also a desire to delay talking about that issue.
I'm happy to discuss it. Does anyone have thoughts on that? I mean, I actually think sort of my core feeling after sort of all these conversations we've had with everybody is that we're sort of half in this world where we don't, for the last cycles, haven't actually done our own elections ourselves solely because we've sort of had this dynamic with the county that could go away at any moment the way it's currently constructed. So the question is, do you sort of move in that direction? And what I would care about, and I think anyone should care about, is higher turnout. And you're certainly on the gubernatorial ballot or the presidential ballot, you're going to get higher turnout. So which one that they would agree to move it to, or the you know, anyone who the powers that be to have decision making about that, I care less about which one it is and more about that they would move towards that thing of fully being on to the county system and the state ballot. But so I mean, that's sort of where my cards are of how I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I think I'm similar. I have a slight preference for the presidential election, not intending to disrespect the slight preference that the survey showed for the gubernatorial. It's just a shorter ballot. I mean, you could be on page 6 or 7 of the state ballot, whereas the presidential ballot is just much, much shorter. And I'm concerned of voter drop off when the ballots get really long.
So let's spin this another way. Is there anyone who's sort of doesn't believe that, you know, regardless of which one of those ballots, that we should be recommending and moving towards that direction, that so the election should ideally be out of being in its own sequence and being quasi managed with the help of the county and actually be fully tied into what the county ballot is doing? Is there anyone who's sort of against that and thinks we should just kind of do it the way we've been doing it and keep doing it that way?
So for the sake of efficiency, I guess we could poll to see if there's a preference for one statewide ballot over the other, and then just use the poll to inform a motion. So I'll go on the limb and say I prefer the presidential. Anybody else willing to share preferences?
I'll, for the sake of, yeah, I'll say gubernatorial. Just the reasoning there is that I appreciate Scott's point on the presidential. I just think so much gets drowned out in presidential races that people's attention to a local level matter is often colored by the presidential election, which I think we're trying to move away from by moving to nonpartisan. And also makes it more difficult to pay attention to it. So I'd be in favor of a gubernatorial election. But again, like I said, I think Scott's concern about the length of the ballot is an issue. So what I would advocate, and this doesn't have to be part of a motion or anything, but what I would advocate is that the city be on a separate ballot. So when you would go, you would get 2 ballots, you would get the gubernatorial ballot and you would get the municipal ballot. And I brought this up with the director of the Anne Arundel County Board of Elections. And I think the response from his was like, we could look into that. Like that could be a solution. There's no like firm response, but that might be one way to mitigate the valid concern that Scott has.
I'll go on the record of saying I don't really have a preference between the two. I think it seems a little more logical to have it on the presidential ballot for logistics concerns, but at the same time, it could be on the gubernatorial ballot as more of a theming concern. It being a more local elections. That being said, I would disagree that having 2 ballots would be helpful. It's a lot easier to scan 1 than 2. I mean, that just might come from me as an election official, but yeah, my preference would probably be towards presidential, but honestly, like they're both bigger shows than what we have now, so it's going to be an improvement either way.
Yeah.
So I don't want to pick a fight on that.
JM, if I could ask, like, given all your experience, like, do you think that having 2 ballots would be unhelpful? I know it complicates the counting process, but unhelpful from like the voters' perspective, like it would be difficult. Would it complicate the voters?
It would complicate the entire system because, we scan all our ballots. And if they ask for a mail-in ballot, they would have to be mailed both types of ballots. And not only would they have to be mailed both types of ballots, they would have to return both types of ballots. And we wouldn't be able to canvass those until we could open up the envelopes. And we can't open up the envelopes until a certain date. And then we would have to, be like, if this person didn't send in this ballot, does that mean they don't want to vote it or what? It just opens up a whole new slew of questions and complications. So keeping everything on 1 ballot is probably easiest and would be lead to a more secure election, in my opinion.
Eileen?
Yeah, I agree with John Michael. You're essentially then running 2 concurrent elections. And I think there was talk about even having to go to another room, which means you're going to have a whole duplicate setup. So I agree with John Michael. You're really setting up 2 elections to be run at the same time. And I'm not positive that the county would go for it. I know David said that he would look into it, but I think it would be I think it would be difficult to pull off.
Andrew?
I think I already stated my preference was gubernatorial.
So my view is, my view is I think we should get the opinion of the Anne Arundel County Board of Elections. So they said they would look into it. So I think that should inform our opinion on like the difficulty of the process. I do think from the voters' perspective that it would help matters. Voters right now, especially in Annapolis, are used to voting separately for their gubernatorial candidates on down and for their municipal elections. So if they're given just 2 ballots, I think that would, my view is that would be the most optimal way to avoid the municipal elections getting lost, like in the broader swath of candidates that a voter would have to vote for. But again, I don't want to get us too off track. This could be something that's useful for a work session. The key though is that I would prefer gubernatorial for the timing switch.
So forgive me, Ian, if I missed you sharing your preference, but we're pretty divided. I've got Faye and Andrew preferring the gubernatorial, me preferring the presidential, and John Michael with no preference, but Also saying for logistics reasons, he could see the presidential making sense. I'm just sharing that for context of the motion I'm going to offer. At this point, I'd like to offer a motion that we recommend moving to a statewide election cycle, not stating a preference, knowing that we'll have to discuss the merits or the pros and cons of each in our recommendation if we can't resolve this further in a future work session. So I think we're all in agreement that it makes sense to move to a statewide cycle. It sounds like we're divided about which one. There are pros and cons of each. And so all this would say is we recommend moving to one. In our report, we'll discuss the pros and cons of each. Or if we have a work session, maybe we'll resolve a preference, but.
Okay. It's a motion. Is there a second?
Well, I'll second the motion.
Thank you.
And I'll just add to the discussion. Yeah.
Andrew?
I just wanted to, I mean, perhaps Faye, I didn't get the sense that did you want to move, or did you feel like if we had to move, you would prefer the gubernatorial? Like, I just want to make sure I was clear on your position on that one.
Yeah, my position is if we have to move, it would be for gubernatorial. But Ian, we didn't get your preference.
Yeah, I'm basically for moving. I think it's probably the right thing to do, and I'm kind of agnostic on which one, whether it's gubernatorial or presidential. I mean, frankly, it's going to be. I'm more interested in how we make the case in the document for all the reasons why moving would make sense, right? That the council is not aware of, and right, like I think there would be lots of cases to be made about that. So, but yeah, I think that's going to be a real tough hill to climb with that recommendation. So like the challenge is like, whether it's either one, I think would be a huge success if they could actually move in that direction. So for the purposes of Scott's amendment, which is sort of clean on which cycle, but just to sort of see if we can get to a position of saying we think we should move in that direction. If there's no other comments, we can take a vote. All in favor? Aye. Great, thank you. So what else do we want to get into, or what do we want to see as for agenda items for a work session that we'll see if we can put together rather quickly here in the next week or two?
I think we only have a week. I think we have a week left to vote on issues.
Is that true, Eileen? Have you heard any more?
Well, it's the 22nd,
Yep.
so. Yeah, we're running out of runway.
Yep. Andrew?
So I think unfortunately, Regina's not here. I think that in terms of the actual writing, I mean, if you have all the motions made and everything, you can float around a draft and then vote on it and then say it's accepted with the amendments and then finish the final one later. But as of the 22nd, the group is no more, so you can't vote on something afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yep.
You have to have you have to agree on everything that's going to go in the report beforehand. And then for the actual writing, you may be able to kind of, pass the draft with any sort of changes that are written into it, assuming that those changes are made correctly.
Fun.
I mean, it's not a binding document, so it's just,
No.
if only.
Andrew?
Sure, I'll just throw some issues out that I think might be useful for us to discuss in a work session or whatever forum. One is, and I think I think Scott's report already touches on this as like a concern, is expanding the Board of Supervisors elections to 5 voters, or at least giving unaffiliated individuals greater access to that board. So that would be one I think we should touch on. I think we need to, now that we know that we're moving, or that we're going to recommend moving to state law, I think we need to really look at like what state law says with respect to campaign finance and what potential differences we want to recommend for the city. So that would be number 2. Number 3, I think it's important that we make a recommendation related to redistricting. And specifically, I think we should at least discuss, I'm not sure where others stand on this, but I think we should at least discuss recommending greater independence for the redistricting task force. So that would be another item. And then 2 more is that we need, in my view, clarification on citizen-led ballot questions. I don't know if we can go back to the Office of Law and just, if there's any pathway to get an answer to this, or maybe there's another avenue. Maybe somebody knows, like election lawyers, or maybe somebody at higher levels, maybe at the county or the city, the county or the state, would know the answer to that question. But I think that's incumbent on us to have a clear answer to that before we submit our report. And then finally, something that we haven't talked about at all, but was brought up repeatedly in our public hearings, is issues surrounding trust in elections. I think that is something that we need to discuss in some capacity. There is questions about the maintenance of voter rolls. There is questions about voter ID, et cetera. So I'm not taking any positions on those, but I do think that requires some attention from us, because it was brought up in our citizen input sessions multiple times, and that's the point of citizen input in my view.
Thank you for going through that stuff. Eileen?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond a little bit to the concern with the voter rolls, which is something that's ongoing with the Board of Supervisors of Elections. One of the main reasons that the voter rolls are the way they are is that even though voters have the responsibility or the right to be a voter, they don't take the initiative to let the Board of Elections know when they move. So what happens is you'll have people who say, I've got 4 kids and I'm getting ballots for all of them, or I'm getting information. We need everybody to realize it's their responsibility when they move, that they notify the Board of Elections. We try to do we did a communication plan in the last election, and that was one of the things we really tried to stress to people. And again, when people bring it up, it's a valid concern, but it lies with the voters. Voters need to take the responsibility to be in communication with the Board of Elections. We even put out information saying if you live in a building, or if you're at an address and you receive ballots that the person no longer lives there, please notify the Board of Elections, or just drop them in a drop box or mail them back, not here. And that's part of the education that needs, but the county runs the voter registration, and it is part of ERIC, which does communicate with a number of other states. Unfortunately, it's shrinking. I don't know what it's down to, but it's at least, I think, 30, so that
Yeah, Virginia left recently.
yeah, they communicate among Maryland. So if someone files for, say, a driver's license in another state, that information will come back. So there are limits there. But again, I just wanted to clarify that, because I do hear it. And I guess that's part of my own frustration being on the Board of Elections is, please let the Board of Elections know if you move, because that's how you can't call somebody, you can't call up and say, this person, you have to take them off the rolls. They have to self-report, and people just don't do it, unfortunately.
Yeah, the Board of Elections is not Big Brother. We don't track people's movements. Like she said, it's when people change their licenses or they register in a different state, if that state has an agreement with Maryland, or if they're in ERIC, we can, send them a card saying, hey, is this true that you moved? Sometimes, like the state of Florida will send us a list of people that have moved, but it's, like that guy that said that there were 6 people at that one house at the at the thing last week. Like that's not on us. We keep the records as clean as we can, but we can't take people off the records without evidence. I mean, sometimes it's DHMH, or I guess Department of Health now, that sends us a list of people who have died, or we have a whole bunch of different checks and balances, but we're not perfect.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think, definitely would not blame like the Board of Supervisors elections or anything like that for that situation. But as a task force, I think we do want to look at solutions to it. Maybe it is recommending that city council fund a broader voter education plan, right? They're going to need to educate, especially if they make changes, they're not going to need to educate the population on those changes that are made, and maybe that could be part of the education initiative. So yeah, I think there's lots of things we can do there to try to address it, but that's again a work session item.
Okay, thank you for that list. Anyone else have any things we want to make sure we get into? Okay, so I guess, Eileen, we need to scramble and see if there's a possibility to do a work session somewhere that's quasi-official.
I mean, I'll
It's
talk
not a
with
work
Jane
session
about
if we're planning to vote.
Sorry, Scott?
It's not a work session if we're planning to vote. Sorry,
it.
not
We have to
to
have a meeting.
split hairs.
No, I know. Yeah, so like the question is like, what are we talking about doing with the time we have left, from I don't know. I get the idea of wanting to discuss things in a setting, but we're sort of, what does that look like?
So I would suggest we do like a work session like we had at I think it was Pip Moyer, and then another meeting. It could be even like a day or two later to get the maybe virtual, where we'll have things teed up that we know we want to vote on, and then we could and do that. That I do sort of think that sort of thing would be helpful. But I leave it to others from what they decide. I just want to make sure, did the I think it was maybe Faye or Eileen's point, did that make the list about where individuals live and their residency and whatnot? Because I do think that would be also useful to discuss in the work session. So, or if we have like a regular meeting, either one.
Is it too late to ask for like a month extension or something? Are we past that time period?
I think we're past that time period. I can ask.
It would require an act of the council. Does the council meet next week?
No, they met.
They met this
this
past
week.
Monday.
Yeah.
So I knowing that it requires an act of the council, I mean, unless they can do it retroactively.
I can ask. It was actually an appointment by the mayor with the approval of the city council. So I don't know if the mayor can add. I'll ask her what the
Yeah.
options are.
Yeah, I mean, since we have the Ward 1 residents asking us to take more time, maybe the mayor might be interested in doing something like that.
And I think the resolution that created the task force and empowered the mayor to appoint it set the timeline, which is why I
Right.
think it takes an act of the council to amend it.
I think that the task force can certainly, even doing broad recommendations, will have served its purpose and will, set a course for follow-up. I mean,
Could we?
I don't know, what the other option is, could it reconvene later?
I was going to say, could we submit something with broad recommendations, and one of those recommendations be that we be given additional time to either go in and to add more detail or whatever the case may be to those recommendations? So that will be one of our recommendations, like, okay, we got into this. And really the first meeting should not have been counted as the starting point, because you're just forming it and you're getting officers and doing those types of things.
Right. Well, historically, task forces have started actually when the appointments are made. And
Okay,
what's happened in the past is the appointment's made and then they don't meet for a while and then it's even shorter. So that's why that was
okay,
started with the
Okay.
first meeting to actually extend it. So,
okay. Okay, but if we're able to offer broad recommendations, but one of our recommendations be that the task force be given additional time to really flesh out those recommendations and add more meat to it.
Well, let's do this. I will get with Eileen. We'll see what the answers are to those questions from people at City Hall, see if there is any wiggle room, see if there's the ability to do a work session at some point very, very soon here. And then a voting session, in this venue following that. And obviously then we'll need to see what everyone's schedules are, right? So it's just, but like, we will try to tomorrow morning get a handle on some of those questions, Eileen, I think, and then
sure.
we'll see what the options are. And I think we'll have to just sort of roll with whatever,
Mhm.
how much latitude we have. Yeah.
We could start with asking Mark what openings are available next week for virtual meetings.
So things are very, very busy. We have all sorts of afternoon presentations and evening meetings. It's possible we could squeeze something in on Tuesday, the 19th, or Friday, the 22nd.
What times?
I was assuming your normal meeting
6
time from
o'clock,
6 to
okay.
8. If you wanted to do a daytime meeting, I've got some more flexibility.
What are you all's availability?
I can make either of those work, but 19th probably makes more sense sooner rather than later. But if anyone has a conflict with that,
I could do that as well. 19th.
I mean, I would venture to say take them both. The 19th to finish things out and then the 22nd to actually do a final vote. I think you'll need both days. Because you actually have to write the report.
So we're holding the 19th and the 22nd at 6 p.m. I'm sorry.
yeah, I mean, I think that's what he's proposing. Was that unless people have some availability during the day, but I would imagine that's not the case. But yeah,
Well, let's just look at those two and I'll
Let's do
talk
that.
with Regina and Hillary.
great. So that'd be
Can you
great. if we
pencil
could
us in, Mark?
block those.
You're being penciled as we speak.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and then we'll get some clarity tomorrow about timing and, I mean, the contours of what a work session.
Okay, so just for clarification, again, a work session, you cannot take votes. So if you're talking about a work session and then a meeting. Now, a work session does not meet virtually, so there's flexibility in terms of doing it at another time then.
Yeah, I think that's what Andrews is definitely interested in, but
For what it's worth, you could request the council chambers on the 19th, do an in-person meeting, and then switch to a live meeting, and we can turn the cameras on. And you could accomplish it all in one night.
When I've brought that up to Regina before, she's struck it down, but I can ask again.
Yeah, I've had discussions with Hillary, and the concern is setting a precedent for use of the council chambers for
Right.
boards and commissions, but because you all are a task force, they were willing to make the exception. I don't know if anything else is scheduled in the council chambers. I know a standing committee meeting is not scheduled. They're
Gotcha.
supposed to be done by 5 o'clock.
I would be in favor of a marathon work session followed by meeting on the 19th, and I'll splurge for the pizza to fuel us to go through it.
I'm not available on the 19th, so I'll be out of town.
Okay, I will also add that there would be the possibility of bringing you in virtually, Eileen,
Mhm.
if you were out of town and available and had access to a camera.
I'm hoping to be eating lobster and drinking beer that evening up in Cape Cod, so,
All right.
Yeah.
but thank you. I'll consider that offer.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so Andrew.
Yeah, I think whatever we decide, I think it would be useful to have like a representative from like Office of Law there if we could possibly. Just given the time crunch here, we could just hopefully get at least like preliminary answers to some questions. So if it's possible to invite them as well, I think that would be great. And for the record, like I personally think a work session would probably get us moving a little bit faster in terms of like getting stuff done. But if there's more support for just a straight meeting and a vote all at the same time, I'm perfectly fine with that.
Okay, that's helpful. We'll get into this in the morning, Eileen, and see
Right.
what our
I'll
options
touch
are.
base. Yeah, I'll give Regina a call in the morning.
Thank you, and
And
I'm
Hillary.
happy to do that as well, and then we figure out with Mark. But yeah, at this point, like if you hold the evening of the 19th, whether it's in person or virtual, and then we'll figure out sort of the timeline issues. And I mean, it might end up being sort of a marathon session to figure out what we can get together. So I'm
And if you need to, you can usually also just do a quick meeting, like if you're just taking a vote, you can do a special meeting. The
exactly.
challenges sometimes come too in terms of posting agendas, et cetera. So.
Yep.
If we're looking at Tuesday, the 19th, you need to think about an agenda.
Yep.
By Friday.
Okay, I will follow up with her as well.
Item 1, finalize work.
Yeah, exactly. Do the thing. Okay, so it sounds like we have some potential next steps, some questions that will help inform what next week looks like. Sounds like everyone has flexibility on the 19th, so we will get rolling on that. Anyone else have anything else tonight? I have a list of sort of things we definitely want to get into next. Thank you for identifying some questions. Obviously, new other items people want to make sure we consider. Please, have those in mind too. But okay, so with that, I'm happy to stop and we can regroup once we have some more information here. So do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Great. All in favor? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.